So good morning. Welcome to panel 4, an overview of Irish writing, which is part of the 15th Symposium of Irish Studies in South America, Virtual Encounters. My name is Camila Batista. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo and director of the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies. Okay, so our audience may ask questions in the chat. I will ask them to our speakers after the last presentation. Okay. I'm going to introduce each speaker before their presentations, and we can leave the questions to the end, right? Our first speaker is Bruce Stewart, who holds degrees in English literature and language from Trinity College Dublin and the University of California at Santa Barbara, as well as language teaching qualification from the Royal Society of Arts and Cambridge University. He taught English and Anglo-Irish literature at the University of Ulster in the United Kingdom before joining the staff at Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte and has taught in North Africa and Arabia in times past. He has also served as the literary director of the Princess Grace Irish Library in Monaco and 2 times secretary of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literature. His paper is titled Makebelieve and Irish Independence, a new look at James Stephens, the chairwoman's daughter. So Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, it's 15 minutes and I'm going to keep things quite short if I can. So this really is kind of ad lib. Well, here's a paper anyway, and I'm going to give you the first paragraph if I may, because it sets the tone of the writing. In this paper, I want to take a fresh look at the policeman in James Stephens' little novel Charwoman's Daughter in the light of recent controversy about the Royal Irish Constabulary. As you know, the Irish government tried to commemorate it and were refused by the people who retained strong feelings against that body of men. However, it does appear that James Stephens has succeeded in anticipating some of the feelings of the Irish people in this matter, and that's the substance of my paper. The crucial event is the 1913 Lockout Strike, and you can see there the demonstrations when the Irish police, as they were then called, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, charged with batons on a crowd demonstrating against the employers' lockout, itself a response to the workers' strike. The strike went on for 8 months and ended with the retreat of the workers, unfortunately after much suffering, but it became a crucial turning point because it, for once, cast the police in the light of agents of the British rather than peacekeepers in Dublin. What does that have to do with James Stephens' novel? Well, the novel is essentially a romance, as you can see from the picture at the bottom. It's a Mary, Mary story. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? And it's about a dreamy girl, but it's a dreamy girl who also has forms of friendship with the policeman, or at least an acquaintance. It begins with the mother, who's a working class woman getting out of bed to go to work. A laboring man with a wife and 6 children are living in the house, but the daughter goes back to bed for a couple of hours, after which she tidies the house and takes a prance to St. Stephen's Green. Sorry, I got my buttons confused for a moment. At St. Stephen's Green, she watches the ducks and drakes and has various amusing and amiable things to say about them. She's interested in the drakes, for example, who have no chicks at all for some peculiar reason. And she watches the ducks swimming with their mother and delights in their early ability to perform such an athletic feat. She tries to speak duck language and so on. In other words, she's living in the world of childhood. At some point early, a policeman arrives on the scene, and we learn that he's possessed of a sexual instinct common to men and dogs and beetles and various other animals. And according to the internal principle of this instinct, it continues to be tenacious in the pursuit of its ambition until either it is routed, meaning chased off, or appeased. Love and hate are equally magnetic and compelling, we're told. Now, this is in some sense a rather dangerous individual because, aside from all else, he's invested with civic power. After Mary fled from the embrace of the great policeman, because she's frankly become frightened and intimidated, he came to think more closely of her than he had used, and her image was throned now in anger. And henceforth the anger will dominate, but he's so strongly attracted to her that he returns with a marriage proposal to her mother's house. At the same time, he feels her social inferiority. One half of his body was passion, the other was a frenzy for vengeance. He feels that her crooked spirit needs to be straightened with a truncheon. He could beat her into submission. She must be pulled from her eminence and stamped into her native depths. And he argues to himself at the end, will not women cherish a bruise that it may be medicined by male kisses? At the moment I can't see your faces, but I take that to be a fairly shocking sentiment. The position of the police is well known in Ireland. They, of course, amongst other things, were the agents who operate the eviction system, operating for the landlords. The rural police were armed, the RIC. The urban police were not, the DUP. And this man is a member of the DUP contingent. In the second para here, we see him thinking about the young man called a skinny whippersnapper, who seems to have won Mary's affections instead of him. And he has no kind regard for him or for her. He calls her a slut from the slum, except that a flutter of wings is beating in his heart, and at the same time he hears her voice mocking him. So something must be done. The young man himself, I think everyone will recognize the picture of James Joyce there, but James Joyce is not the young man. In fact, the young man himself is fairly pugnacious, but he's pugnacious in a cause. He's an Irish nationalist. He might be a little bit like James Stephens himself when he was writing the Sinn Féin Journal for the Citizen newspaper. She once asked him, could he fight? And he said, of course he could. Decent people have no respect for the police, their fighting qualities or their private characters. They're like soldiers, landlords, employees. A policeman would arrest a man for next to nothing. The sight of a soldier annoyed him, the young man, for he saw a conqueror trampling vaingloriously through the capital of his country. And you can see at this point that Stephens is associating the policeman with the British administration in Ireland, the colonial administration. In fact, the police are the gendarmerie of the colonial power in the country. Mrs. Makebelieve is a heroic feminist character. She was recognized as such by Rebecca West in a contemporary view of 1912. Bats off the policeman, repudiates them successfully. Finally, in fact, she says, neither my daughter nor yourself have ever hinted before that you were courting. And then she raises the question of her social class, because it happens that the policeman is an O'Connor and related to the woman for whom she works as a charwoman, that's to say, as a daily. And this is a very odd feature of the novel, highly improbable in a sense, but it's part of the class structure of the novel and what he's trying to tell us. In the end, she says, towards the bottom, I never did like you, and I never will like you, and I'd sooner see my daughter married to anyone at all than to yourself. And at that point, the daughter joins in and confesses she doesn't love the policeman. She feels harassed by him, and the match is off. But the policeman has pushed himself forward beyond his right in the matter, and he's been rebutted by a working-class Irish woman who lives in the tenements. Your illustration there is a picture of the tenements in Henrietta Street, Dublin, as they have been reconstructed in recent times. The Insurrection of Dublin is Stephen's book about the 1916 Rising. I don't need to tell you anything about that. It was an influential book because it indicated to the British reader that the Irish nation was possibly behind these men. And in the preface, written in the same year, he said, if freedom is to come to Ireland, as I believe it is, the Easter Rising was the only good thing that could have happened. He means, in fact, that national dignity and pride depends upon it. If the national imagination was to be stirred to the dreadful business, which is the organizing of freedom, and both imagination and brains have been stagnant in Ireland this many years, the blood of brave men had to be sanctified. And finally, whereas we now may be allowed to march into freedom with the honors of war. So he's in favor of the 1916 Rising, although if we looked at his biography, we would find he's a Protestant, working-class young man who should not by rights or by ethnic inclination be on the side of the nationalist and predominantly Catholic rebels. The affair of 1913 changed everything. In the same preface, he writes, in the same text, he writes about the Irish Citizen Army. They were raised against the police, who in the big strike 2 years ago had acted with unparalleled savagery. Later on in the book, he says, the great strike of 2 years ago remained undoubtedly as a bitter and lasting memory. Still, it was not hatred of England. It was hatred of local traders, and particularly hatred of the local police, local powers and tribunals. In the next text that I want to explore, he has, curiously, a comic version of the persona of the Irish policeman. It's called The Croc of Gold, and it's his most popular of all works. It's pure fantasy, or rather, it's a mixture of Celtic mythology and Irish folklore with a philosophical angle peculiarly his own. And some of it actually touches the marrow of Irish politics, although in a comic fashion. The philosopher is arrested by the police on the supposition that he's murdered 2 people. It's a ridiculous supposition, and there's no grounds for it, and even the police don't believe there's any grounds, but nevertheless, he's frog-marched to the local barracks. As they go, he speaks to the police sergeant, who's a little like the unnamed policeman whom Mary Makebelieve had met, and he says to the sergeant, I do not see any necessity in nature for policemen. Gods and cats do not employ these extraordinary mercenaries. He talks about the crows in particular, whose civilization is based on mutual aid and tolerance for each other's idiosyncrasies. And he concludes, or he begins to conclude, because in fact he wants to speak forever, if policemen were necessary to a civilization, crows would certainly have evolved them. But I insist they have not got any policemen in their republic. At this point, he's cut off because the police sergeant forces one of the ordinary policemen, the constables, to talk about his own background in order to block out the sound of the philosopher. But things don't go well, in fact, because he's shortly sent to Dublin in a car for presumably hanging without process of law. It's all very Kafkaesque, if you like. Does he escape? Well, yes. In a lengthy chapter called The Thin Woman's Journey, the title character and her children make a march which takes them to the brew or fortress of Angus, the ancient Irish god, who is the equivalent of Pan in Greek theology. That doesn't prevent Pan from making a separate appearance in the narrative. And we hear this: down to the city they went dancing and singing, leaving the magical brew, among the streets and shops, telling their sunny tale. And they took the philosopher from prison, and even the intellect of man they took from the hands of doctors and lawyers and sly priests and professors whose mouths are gorged with sawdust, and merchants, the awful people of Fomor. These people, these middle-class people, are all in effect the evil invaders of Ireland in the Book of Invasions. So then at the end of the narrative, he doesn't even bother to describe how the philosopher is released by an old woman and 2 children. It's simply a convenience. The convenience is there to introduce his most extraordinary chapter, the collision between the Royal Irish Constabulary and the leprechauns of Ireland. There are a few other novels to touch on here briefly, if I may. One is Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman. The title reveals it is indeed about a policeman. The second is James Plunkett's Strumpet City, which I mention here out of honor because it's a magnificent treatment of the 1913 Lockout Strike, but I have nothing particularly to discuss at the moment. And the third, more briefly, is Sebastian Barry's The Steward of Christendom. Well, I might go to The Steward of Christendom first. You may all be aware of this, and I'm preaching to the choir, the converted, but in Sebastian Barry's play, the Steward of Christendom is the ex-head of the Dublin Metropolitan Police who ordered the fatal charge on the workers. And he is therefore a national pariah. And it's an act of great imagination and courage, or if you prefer, revisionism, on the part of Sebastian Barry to give him a heroic stage role, magnificently played by Tom Dunn, who appears there. Dermot Dunn? Someone might remind me. It's skipped my mind for the moment. Fantastic actor, now unfortunately dead. Now, this is a very plangent speech, and it deserves a little bit of recitation. The policeman is explaining how he felt as a servant of the crown. He said, I loved her for as long as I lived. When I was a young recruit, it used to frighten me how much I loved her. Loved Victoria. The great world she owned was as ship-shape as a ship. We're told the trains went sleekly through the fields and her mark was everywhere. Ireland, Africa, the Canadas, every blessed place. By the way, the Canadas is a very Barry touch, a very Sebastian Barry touch. There's no such place as the Canadas at all. He pluralizes it in a curiously Irish way. She loved her prince. I loved my wife. Even the simple man I was, could love fiercely. Victoria. That word fiercely is a key word in the play, and it grows more widely in Barry's writing, and it's an affirmation of emotional authenticity. So here is a possibility that Irish people could love these odious men who were servants of the landlords, servants of the workers, and enemies of the people. So much so that, in fact, by and large, the assassination of 400 members of the Irish police force was tolerated during the Civil War. They were the prime targets of the IRA, and that's what all the fuss is about at the present time, because obviously there were reprisals which cost a lot of lives. I take you now to the last novel, which is The Third Policeman, and I don't intend to read much of this. I'm just going to flash some text on the screen. I hope you can see it. I'll check back that in a moment. The first page is intriguing. If you look at the word Parnell in the center, he would mention Parnell with the customers and say that Ireland was a queer country. The father, the central character, who becomes a murderer and who is tormented in the police station, not tortured, tormented, and discovers ultimately that he's dead and he's been killed by his accomplice, and he's actually in a place very like hell itself. But the Parnell reference makes it clear that this is set in approximately 1890, shortly before the fall of Parnell in 1890 through in the famous divorce case, and therefore it is a historic novel, even when it was written in 1939. By 1969, when we saw it first in publication, it was a very evidently historical novel. But it's historical with a very strong contemporary accent, and that's one of the peculiar traits. It's also, in a certain sense, reprehensible. The last phrase is, we were happy enough in a queer, separate way. In fact, they were miserable. It was a horrible Irish family. His parents died quite early, leaving him alone with his accomplice. His father was a strong farmer, and what his mother was, I dare not say, but she used to spend time privately with customers in the evening when I was in bed, and so forth. So there's a suggestion that it's something a little bit other than a pub, a little bit more edgy than that. The most famous element in the novel is the iteration of the three policemen's extraordinary comic characters. And these characters like McCrushkeen or Sergeant Pluck are readily connected with the melodramatic figures who appear in Dion Boucicault's great farce melodramas of the 1860s, especially Aranapoe, which has a RIC policeman, and even Lady Gregory's The Rising of the Moon, which have these comical police characters. It's also about bicycles and the extraordinary theory that the molecules in a bicycle exchange with the molecules in your body, producing in time a female bicycle or a male bicycle whose behavior must be monitored very carefully. And it's also about atomic theory, because the third policeman of the title is actually a kind of Einsteinian figure who's busy inventing matter in the basement of the police station. He's in fact God, but he's a rather demonic version of God, which equates with the fact that Flann O'Brien believed that atomic theory was demonic. He had very good reason, Hiroshima. So it's a censorious work vis-a-vis modernity. And finally, there's an extraordinary vision of landscapes. I'm not going to read it, but I'd strongly recommend you dip into this book if you don't know it, as absolutely a touchstone of Irish comic satire. And the description of the landscape is bizarre, to say the least. So you know from it the mind of the man concerned is deeply alienated from ordinary human feeling. So there are our characters. We have some portraits of James Stephens. We have George Russell, who identified him as a genius, a word that George Russell loved to use for his favorites. And we have W.B. Yeats, who started the literary revival. The peculiarity of the literary revival is that it was intended as a revival, to revive a Celtic spirit, but that couldn't work. And we then enter into what might be called the cultural anthropology of revivals. What happens when you posit a revival of an ancient literature side by side with a modern literature? Well, it produces the Croc of Gold, and it produces the Third Policeman. James Stephens, as you see at the bottom corner, was quite successful amongst English writers. He left Ireland in 1922, like most Protestant writers. George Russell also, John Eglinton. James Joyce obviously had his own trajectory. There you see James Joyce with James Stephens. There was an idea that Stephens would finish Finnegan's Wake. James Stephens was very small. John O'Sullivan, the Irish tenor, smoking a cigarette there, was very large. I have some last novedades for you. Mary Makebelieve has been translated by Ana Graça Canaan, UFRN, and will appear from Paco Editora in Sao Paulo as Mary Makebelieve in the new year, with a cover illustration generously supplied by the Irish artist Siobhan Cuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jessica Grant Craveiro, who is graduated as a Bachelor of Journalism at Faculdade Casper Libero and English and Portuguese at University of São Paulo. She's currently a master's student in USP's area of Linguistic and Literary Studies in English, researching contemporary Northern Irish literature. Her paper is titled In Their Prime, Dislocated Aging and Gender Concepts in Mary O'Donnell's Short Stories. So, Jessica, the floor is yours.
So, thank you, Camila. Thank you, everyone that's present. And I would also like to start this presentation thanking the Italian scholar Giovanna Talone, who last year gave classes at USP about aging studies in Irish literature, and that made this presentation possible. So we're going to observe two short stories of the Irish writer Mary O'Donnell, the one who was just interviewed by Lucy in the last moment of this symposium. So I believe because of this interview that Mary needs no introduction, but in case you missed it, I strongly recommend you go and check it in YouTube later. I'll shortly mention that O'Donnell has writings in poetry, short stories, and also novels. And throughout the last 30 years, she's been writing this diverse work. She offers a very rich literature, always well-updated characters, and precise use of words descriptions, as we will see here today. So today we will observe two of her short stories that bring a topic that is recently being more discussed among critics, the female aging representation, or concepts associated with Irish literature. And what is this topic about? In her 1972 article named The Double Standard of Aging, Susan Sontag observed how aging is a concept constructed socially, culturally, and historically. And in this construction, it is applied differently to women and men. According to Sontag, this double standard of aging is more permissive with men and associates women's beauty with youthfulness, disqualifying them as they age. Janet King, in her introduction to the book, Discourses of Aging in Fiction and Feminism, comments that, and here I quote, occasionally attention will be drawn to this disadvantaged position of women, but more often when the subject of female aging is news, attention is drawn to women's bodies and appearance, as it has been throughout their lives. In Western culture, however, the term aging implies decline and deterioration, and for women, the loss of sexual identity. King highlights that fiction by women is a place where we can observe narratives about aging contests, the powerful discursive context, and offer, quote, alternative ways of understanding aging in women, unquote. According to Kathy McLean, Michaela Schrager-Thru, and Margaret O'Neill, female aging images can be resisted and reshaped by visual or verbal expressions. And this is what I believe these two short stories are an example of, resistance and reshaping. As a socially constructed concept, aging doesn't have an exact age to affect women, and some concepts dislocate our cultural assumptions of old age to even younger adults. Let's observe two of these characteristics, widowhood and menopause. If we think about a widow, we usually imagine an old woman with white hair and black clothes. This concept is associated with old age, even though it's actually about relationships. In Widow, from her first collection from 1991, O'Donnell presents us to a 35-year-old woman, Lisa, who loses her husband and faces the fact that with her new status, society demands from her the same behavior it expects from an old woman. The cultural construction of widowhood cancels a woman's sexual and intimate life. So apart from the image of widows being old women, I associate this concept to aging due to this expectation of no sexual identity. And as we saw in King's comments, aging implies the loss, yes, of sexual identity. So widowhood forces Lisa to age, and in other words, to act as society prejudices expect from older widows. The second image associated with aging is present in the short story Aphrodite Pauses Midlife. It's menopause. In this narrative, published in Storm Over Belfast in 2008, O'Donnell depicts a middle-aged writer and professor facing menopause, 46-year-old Carol. The character herself perceives her menopause as entering through the portals of old age, old cultural notion as well. As critic Kathleen Woodward explains, and here I quote, for women, the cultural dichotomy of youth and old age has long been underwritten by the biological dividing line between the reproductive and post-reproductive years, with the symbolic date of older age for women understood as coinciding with menopause around the age of 50, end quote. So Woodward continues mentioning how technology has changed this concept, and Janet King agrees with her in a note about the definition of old woman. She says, defining the older woman is problematic since old age, as much as gender, is a cultural construct. Where the menopause was once seen as a prelude to inevitable decline, it is now generally perceived as an experience which happens to women still in their prime. So while both protagonists fit some ideas of old women, being both under 50, the path of both is crossed by strong concepts that are socially associated with aging. This helps to highlight the cultural construction of these images and of aging itself, and I hope helps us to question our ideas and prejudices about old age women. So let's start about in Widow. In Widow, O'Donnell portrays the cycle from the beginning of Lisa's grief just after her husband was cremated, when she could not express real emotions, until the deep and loud mourning she experiences while with another man. Grief is central to this short story, but we will focus on how Lisa's friends see her now that she is a widow and how she fights against this aging status. Through the third-person omniscient narrator attached to Lisa's perspective, the readers have access to her reflections about her new relationship status. I quote, a widow at 35, widow. The word revolted her, bounced tenaciously about as if forcing her to accept its implications. It reminded her to accept its implication. It reminded her of the spider, the one that poisoned its mate after copulation, suggested blackness, mothers of sorrow, women who should never enjoy a man's company or friendship for fear of what people might think. Widow. In the early Christian church, they were a special class of pious women who performed certain duties approved of by the elders, duties which kept them out of mischief, away from other women's men. End of quote. So the narrator lists a few images Lisa has about widowhood. One is mothers of sorrow. Lisa is not a mother, but widowhood suggests that she recalls motherhood. This image also brings a religious reference, as it refers to Our Lady of Sorrows, the Catholic saint who represents the Virgin Mary in her suffering. With piety comes expectation of the end of the widow's sexual life, as one expects a widow to be older and no more sexually active. Lisa adds, for fear of what people might think, pointing out the social pressure, a different pressure, for instance, to what a single woman of the same age would face. Piety status is enforced by the widows from the early Christian church, also controlled by others. While one supposes that a 35-year-old woman would have an active sexual life, be it with a husband, a boyfriend, or even as a single person, it is commonly an outdated idea that an older woman should give up intimacy, especially if she becomes a widow. Piety and loneliness are cultural assumptions of old age. Lisa perceives that the expectations for a widow are the same as those associated with older women. No more romantic relationships or a sexually active life, a devout behavior according to Christian traditions. However, in the beginning of the short story, someone points out that Lisa's husband was in his prime. At 35, the double standard of aging is already present, with him being in his prime, but her being expected to age quickly and stop in time. When Lisa becomes aware of her sexual need, her calmness and apparent acceptance of widowhood starts to change. Let's read another excerpt. It was, she knew, the real beginning of her term, lonely as opposed as alone. Interesting that new poem that Mary just read uses this as well. So lonely as opposed as alone, a place like Alcatraz. This was the start and there might be no escape. In the studio, it was as if she were in solitary confinement, as if she could observe herself doing time with grief. The word choice here highlighted allows the reader to learn about Lisa's feelings towards widowhood as a prison where she would serve her unavoidable lifelong sentence. That's the weight of society expectation. Lisa then starts to behave in a confrontational manner, quickly seducing 3 men. Her friend, Marian, starts to judge her behavior and grows even irritated by her. Marian does not understand Lisa's desire because it resists her cultural assumptions of a widow. In the eyes of society, as we see through Marian, Lisa is no longer a 35-year-old, but just an old widow. Willing to oppose Marian and to refuse the paradigms associated with widowhood, Lisa goes beyond exercising her sexual freedom. She behaves in a manner that could be comparable with another stereotype, adolescent flirtations. In a party, she's attracted to a younger man, Bill, who she calls and meets a few days later. So the characteristics of Lisa's encounter with Bill will bring elements that reminds one of adolescent relationships, such as the awkwardness, the slow rhythm to start things, the fear, and even the hairless body. After having seduced 3 other men, what would be so different that Lisa would now fear? Apart from the approximation to the end of her mourning period, marked by her crying tempest that comes soon after this quote, here in the presentation, one could relate this to her attempt to counterbalance the cultural expectations with her actions, refusing to be classed as an old pious widow, resisting then this aging concept. On the other hand, the protagonist from Aphrodite Pauses Midlife does not resist the aging label, but reshapes it. In the short story, the reader follows 46-year-old writer Carol throughout her day as she arrives at creative writing at Trinity College Dublin to 20-year-old Americans and as she leaves. Through another omniscient narrator attached to the protagonist, the reader can, just as in the previous short story, access Carol's mind and her thoughts about the end of her body's reproductive cycle. O'Donnell draws the age contrast between Carol and the people with whom she crosses. They are old customers of a shop who are seen by Carol as quiet and dressed in comfortable clothes, and there is a young French model in a newspaper. Although Carol seems to be recognized as a successful writer teaching classes in a prestigious university, it is the young and beautiful model who she classifies as in her prime. According to aging studies critics, a woman's prime is culturally associated with youth. However, for men, specifically artistic men like Lisa's husband was, this concept is measured through their work as observed by Susan Sontag and Kathleen Woodward. Carol repeats a cultural concept about a woman's age and her prime being associated with youth and appearance, not her work. She aligns her ideas with this antiquated logic of freshness of sexuality of the youth. With no menstruation, she believes she will become still and unproductive. However, Carol is still productive, writing and teaching in respected university. She is still in her prime. While the words menopause and menstruation are never mentioned, one perceives Carol's reflecting on it through a few quotes which the narrator mentions she is waiting for one last rejuvenating fling, the past 6 months encolored with red anticipatory rings, and her body entering a new quiet and still moment different from something she has lived every month since she was 13 years old. Twice she mentions death as well, as if menopause is a sign of a slow failure of organs. The title reference to opposed Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of sexual beauty and love, is echoed only once during the Sorcerer. While observing the old part of Dublin around the university full of tourists, Carol reminds the oldness of this goddess, which is no longer worshipped. The text says, Touring agencies directed them to this part of the city, where traces of culture are sold. It reminds her of the Turkish men who offer dusty replicas of the goddess Aphrodite to dehydrated tourists outside the ruins of Ephesus, from which people derive inspiration in times of need. So Kara is compared, therefore, to these traces of what Aphrodite signifies, a pansexuality, now dusty and still, but yet source of inspiration, as she is for her students. While entering the university full of historical portals, the writer thinks about this new silent moment of her body and begins to accept it, though reluctantly. The full acceptance comes by the end of the short story when she leaves through those portals. So it says, as Carol stands poised at the traffic lights, it works within the province of her body, like a spy returning gathered intelligence to another, more native place. A man looks her quickly up and down, and in that moment, she knows herself transfigured. She considers her strong hair, once too thick to manage, now thinner, and transfigured, she passes through the portals of stillness, aware of the tide in retreat, driven out along the estuaries of her body by this knowing counterintelligence. In its wake, a new secret, naked and white as death itself. The change from a younger to an older woman, marked for Carol in her menopause, is accepted when she transfigures. From a common woman, she turns into a reference image like the goddess, not a dependent and unattractive old person, but a goddess that inspires. Although throughout the short story the reader perceived Carol's negativity towards the pause, by the end one can interpret that she embraced the idea of entering a new phase. She reshapes the concept of menopause and of female aging by elevating it. Her act of reshaping is different from neither resistance, but both serve to expose the culturally constructed origin of aging images and, through words, offer an alternative understanding on the subject. Lisa and Carol are characters through which O'Donnell defies concepts of what turns a woman into an old woman, be it before 65, as they are, or even after it. These short stories give the reader access to their feelings on the matter in order to construct a more sympathetic approach towards widowhood, menopause, and even actual aging itself. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica, for your words. Our next speaker is Valéria. Valéria da Silva Medeiros is Associate Professor of Literary Theory at the Federal University of Tocantins, Brazil. Senior Visiting Professor at National University of Ireland, Galway, and Associate Researcher at the UNESCO Chair of Reading in Brazil, PUC-Rio. Her main areas of interest are Irish studies, crime novel writing, public libraries, public policies for reading, and prison education. She is going to talk about a brief green history of detective novel, notes on Irish crime writing from past to present. The floor is yours, Valéria.
Okay, so thank you very much for all that are watching me. I can see there are students, former students, colleagues, friends from ABEI. So first of all, I'd like to thank the people that made, people and institutions that made this paper possible, this research possible. And of course, firstly to the organizing committee of this symposium, CAPIS, for the funding for the scholarship as a senior visiting professor at the Irish Studies Centre at National University of Ireland, Galway, and Professor Louis de Peyer, the director of the Irish Studies Centre, for his welcoming and support. Also, Professor Andrea Lameirão Mateus, my colleague back at UFT, and the person that made it possible for me to stay in Ireland by encouraging me to come in first and also substituting for me. Without her, I wouldn't be here. And I would like to thank and dedicate this paper to Declan Farner, who showed me the streets of Galway, the streets of Ken Bruin, this crime novel writer, and introducing me to this great character, Jack Taylor, that is present in some of Ken Bruin's writings. So I both thank Declan Farnan and dedicate this paper to him. So the paper aims at sharing partial results of my findings while carrying out my research project on Irish contemporary crime novels in the Irish Studies Center at NUIG, as I said, from March until October 2020. As I speak, I'm still in Galway. So, a brief overview of the story and reception of Irish crime fiction turned out to be necessary and fundamental in order to assess the current state of affairs when it comes to crime novels in Ireland. So, unfortunately, I don't have nice sets of slides as my predecessors did, but I concentrated on putting on paper these primary results of this semester, almost 7 months here. So it is a great opportunity to put things in order. So the intent of this paper is to explore the remarkable and still recent growth in Irish crime fiction, a growth that has only been accelerating. However, the genre presents a comparatively recent articulation on the island over the last several decades. This expansive and rapid growth has been remarked on by the novelists themselves, by the press, and by several of the overview articles that have been published, one of which fixes the genre's promising prominence as dating back only to the publication of Every Dead Thing in 1999, this first novel by John Connolly. Although one can identify various contributing factors and timelines, certainty about the precise starting point and its reasons is harder to obtain. Since its invention in the 19th century by Edgar Allan Poe, detective fiction has never been more popular. In novels, short stories, and films, on the radio, on television, and now in computer games, private detectives and psychopaths, poisoners, and overworked cops. Tommy Gum gangsters and cocaine criminals are the very stuff of modern imagination, and their creators a mainstay of popular consciousness. Although what critical attention Irish crime fiction has received has often emphasized this recent efflorescence, the genre is not without its domestic precedents, as several critics have noted at varying length. Declan Burke, detective novel writer and critic, points out that Ireland and Irish writers rarely feature prominently in accounts of early crime fiction. If it's still so, however, the reasons may lie in the ways in which the critical codification of the genre took place in Britain and in Ireland. In the 1930s, influential writers such as Dorothy Sayers, Irish herself, subordinated many elements of crime writing's prehistory. In the same period, in newly independent Ireland, much 18th and 19th century Anglo-Irish writing across all genres was neglected, as nationalist critics sought to define a more narrowly authentic nationalist tradition of Irish writing in English and writing. Also, in the 19th century, Irish writers might either address themselves predominantly to an English audience, such as Gerard Griffin in The Collegians in 1829, or draw on elements of Irish life and legend that had no place in this English tradition, as did Samuel Lovers in the Priest Stories in 1831. Meanwhile, still according to Declan Burke, Old belief systems and modern nationalist politics both worked against an easy acceptance, at least among part of the population, of crime fiction as it was developing in the neighboring island, which is Britain. The realities of the marketplace, continues Burke, offer a simpler but equally pressing reason for the perceived failure of crime fiction to take root in 19th century Ireland: the lack of sufficiently large readership to sustain a local popular culture comparable to that of late 19th century England. In Ireland, the market for such popular literature was much smaller where it existed at all. David Clarke, in his book Emerald Noir, Contemporary Irish Crime Fiction, opens it by refuting the mistaken perception that the phenomenon of crime writing is a recent one in Ireland. Irish crime writing has existed, according to David Clarke, for almost as long as the genre itself, that is, back in the 19th century, mid 19th century in the USA with Edgar Allan Poe. He contends that the real change is in the production of crime fiction about Ireland by Irish writers, which he ties to the burgeoning of true crime books in the 1970s and the 1980s, books that set the table for the more recent surge in the 1990s. Elizabeth Mannion takes a similarly long view, tracing contemporary Irish crime fiction's origins back to the 19th century writers such as Sheridan Le Fanu, and forward again to the Golden Age author Freeman Wills in her book A Path to Emerald Noir, The Rise of the Detective Irish Novel. Ian Campbell Ross, among the academics who helped establish crime fiction studies in Ireland, has produced the most substantive single discussion of these antecedents in his introduction to Declan Burke's anthology Down These Green Streets. And now all I can do is show you the book. In that essay, Ross also looks to the Irish Gothic, Le Fanu, as a source of predecessors, as well as to some 19th century texts in which Irish matters were more to the fore, including work by Samuel Lover and Lady Wilde. Despite these abundant examples, Ross also suggests that old belief systems and modern nationalist politics both worked against an easy acceptance, at least part of population of crime fiction, as I said before. More recent antecedents are scattered across the 20th century by authors including Liam O'Flaherty, Freeman Wills Crofts, Cecil Day Lewis, under his pen name Nicholas Blake, Sheila Pym, and other writers, but mostly Childers, whose novel The Riddle of the Sands, published in 1903, is often regarded as among the first spy novels in Irish literature. This is not an insubstantial collection of texts, but little suggests much of a building critical mass until the very end of the 20th century. Although thrillers about the Northern Irish Troubles were produced in large quantities throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, they were often written by non-Irish journalists, a complex and problematic case, such as Aaron Kelly puts in his book. While these local manifestations of wild economic crisis offer some connections to an international crime fiction. Ireland's specificity marks crime fiction in very clear ways. While it is, of course, deeply connected to and influenced by other forms of the genre, much of Irish crime fiction also works within terms that reflect the political, cultural, and historical specificity of the island, Northern Ireland, as well as the Republic of Ireland. Declan Burke suggests that the generation of crime writers that have for the most part been published since the mid-1990s, as from 1994, forming a long list: Colin Bateman, Ken Bruin, Paul Charles, Julie Parson, John Connolly, Benjamin Black, and many others, are prophets without honor in their own country. But for most part, Irish crime writers are more celebrated outside of Ireland than they are at home. I would say Ken Bruin is an exception because he's largely celebrated in Galway City. He's a constant presence in Galway Bay FM. His interviews have been a great resource for my research. If you walk around Galway, if you're lucky enough, you will come across Ken Bruin himself. So the city and Ken Bruin, they are actually characters in his novels, and Galway community celebrates him very highly. So going back to the text, not all the writers set their novels in Ireland. Not all of them are concerned with engaging with contemporary criminality and its consequences. A few are concerned with directly addressing issues of national identity. And I must say that before coming to Ireland, I was under the impression that most crime novelists were really addressing two issues of national identity. It was a happy and great surprise to find out that this is not a consensus. Indeed, there is very little that is homogeneous about the current crop of Irish writers, and the sheer diversity of the kinds of stories told, the styles and approaches employed, is arguably the most potent charm of a group that can be loosely described as a body of Irish crime writers. So all that can be said so far about Irish crime novels is that there is a large variety, and this is really intriguing and exhilarating for a researcher. So such body will be dealt with in detail when of the publishing of this paper. So I will provide you with more names, more references. So my thesis, Brian Cliff from Trinity College, Dublin, in his book, which is the second pillar in Irish crime fiction, alongside with Declan Burke, he presents the crime novel, the Irish crime novel, as a defining genre after the Celtic Tiger Ireland. So all the economic crash and the loss of faith in all institutions beyond the police force, of course, that has been always present in the noir genre after the World War II, but then the lack of trust in banks and, well, this bubble of prosperity that burst in 2008. So I believe Cliff is right when he says that, but I would say I wouldn't be as assertive, and I would go back. I would say that Irish crime writing, from its troubled beginnings in the 19th century to until the aftermath of the Celtic Tiger in the 21st century, has been a seismograph of Irish society, its history, culture, politics, economy, etc. A lot can be seen through the writings since the 19th century. Crime novels provide an exquisite perspective of Irish issues currently under study, including the national identity. So it would not be the defining genre of Ireland, but a possible defining genre under sociological criticism, which is the literary theory current I practice. That is, the conditions of production and reception, not only the writers, but also the readers, as I said earlier in the paper. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will provide you with more names and titles in the paper when time comes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria. Very interesting paper. I look forward to
Thank
reading
you.
your paper.
Thank
Okay.
you. I hope I can meet your expectations.
Oh, okay. I think you will. Now we can have a discussion. We have plenty of time for that. And I'd like to start by asking Jessica a question, actually. Um, I was really impressed by this characterization of the old woman, the widowed, old age. And that reminds me of that image that Ireland has of the old woman that becomes young. And actually, I don't know if I'm saying the name correct, but there is also another mythical figure that is the Kiliash, which is the Queen of Winter as well. And I was wondering if Mary O'Donnell just, twists that image of the old hag as, as something old age becoming now, the moment of a woman's life. I don't know if you could expand more on that.
Before going into Mary, I can't remember now exactly, but one of the critics I read and mentioned, they even say that the importance of talking about aging, female aging in Irish literature, it's also because of that image. So we have the image of the nation as a old and young woman. So that brings the importance of talking about the modern depictions of aging. I don't think Mary brings a lot of this image in these two short stories. She does talk a lot about aging, especially about aging as an artist. So in both short stories, they're artists. If I'm right, Lisa is like a visual artist, something it's not really exact, but yeah, there is a writer giving creative classes, creative writing classes, which is exactly what Mary O'Donnell does. And she talks a lot about this aging process with a female, as a woman, and especially the sexual aspect of it. So when she was in Brazil, she did talk a little bit about that, about trying to depict an old woman as sexually active as something normal and positive, and not with the prejudices society has about that. So I think she brings more the Catholic background of Ireland and this moral perspective that a woman only has a sexual possibility when she's young, and then she's married, and then she's a mother, and then she's old, and that's it, and no more sexual identity. So I think she brings a lot of this Catholic background, and yes, she talks positively about that in these short stories and in other productions as well. And I think this will grow in the next years as it's still an interest of hers. So I think that's it. I don't know if I answered everything.
Yes, sure. I don't know much of her work, so I
She
think
keeps
you did
bringing
answer.
this subject again and again. There's another short story very interesting that brings the male perspective of aging. And it's interesting that it's exactly this. The male is having relationship with a younger girl. So it brings exactly the matter of the prejudices about male aging and female aging. So yeah.
Okay. I want to know if our audience has any questions to the presenters. I will ask one more question then. My question is to Valéria. Earlier this week, we watched the lecture on the Irish dystopian novel, and one parallel that I saw between your talk and that talk was that after the Celtic Tiger, these novels with this heavy atmosphere, dystopian or crime novel, they seem to become more common. I was wondering if you intend to show a more broad time span in your research, or you're focusing on more recent novels. And you said that you don't really see that the crime novel is, the genre for this moment. But how do you see this, plurality of, or this, this abundance of crime novels after the Celtic Tiger period?
Yes, so I'll start, like, say, backwards. So the first thing, I see this diversity as it's great. It's great. So for a researcher, you can pick whichever author you identify yourself with. For example, I'm going to concentrate my research on Ken Bruin, because it's
Okay.
Ken Bruin on the one hand, because he's all about the city. That has to do. Detective novels is a very urban genre.
Yeah.
When it comes to sociological criticism, that we understand crime novels or detective novels, they can only exist when there is a police force, when the cities begin to grow. So that's Ken Bruin can be very local, and he can be very global too. Brian Mcgilliway also does that, but he does it differently. It's in the borderlands. So it's absolutely fascinating, the amount of possibilities you can approach when it comes to Irish crime novel. And when I said, well, the thing is, Brian Cliff thinks that the crime novel defines or depicts Ireland, the Celtic Tiger Ireland. I think crime novel depicts Ireland from the 19th century until the Celtic Tiger. So it's not only the Celtic Tiger, the problems, the troubles, the famine, the lack of a reading public. So you see all the factors that, let's say, prevented Ireland from being part of this history of crime novels all over the world are, let's say, they tell us a lot about Ireland itself. The crime novels were written back in the 19th century, but there was not a reading public as in England. So they had to publish in England. So I think Brian Cliff is correct. It's a great perspective. It's a great genre, and of course, and the thing is, and it's not easy. When I arrived, I soon realized it was not going to be easy. I had to study economy to understand the whole thing. I had to go back to Marx to understand that Ireland in the 19th century and read and economists, they also refer to the crime novel in Ireland as a result of the Celtic Tiger years. So what my thesis is actually to expand that, to read Ireland, to see Ireland, and its history, all its troubles, and all, so through the perspective of crime novels.
Okay. Okay.
So did I answer your question?
Yes,
Or
sure.
did I miss
Sure.
something? But
No,
thank
no,
you very
sure.
much. It was so well, I suppose I conveyed the message. So
Yeah, yeah,
that's it.
sure.
But it's really it's the thing is, I thought I could come up with a few answers to my questions in a semester. Turns
Yeah.
out I cannot. I had to divide my project I have into at least 4 parts. The 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, then the 1990s, and the Celtic Tiger years. So I arrived in Ireland with 1 project in my luggage, and I'm leaving with 4.
Well, that's great. That's great. Actually, there is one more question for you, Valeria. It's
Thank you.
from
Yeah.
Jessica. She asks, she would like to know more. What are the characteristics of these crime novels that bring the Irishness aspects, the Irish identity? What do you find in these novels that bring Irishness to the atmosphere?
Oh yeah.
Well, I would suggest the 2 writers I told you about. They are all great. Most of them are great. Of course, I did not read all of them, but Ken Bruin is a great writer, and among his novels, The Galway Girl will, if you read Ken Bruin, then you get to know Galway, you get to know the inhabitants, you get to know the police force, Jack Taylor. So it's a great novel, and it can be very local and very global too, because Galway is a very cosmopolitan city, but it's very local. And there is Brian Mcgilliway with his Borderlands. It's mostly crimes that take place in the border in the north. And I'm not sure which is his latest, but his latest novel, which now I cannot really remember because I've been dealing with so many, deals with community issues. This body of a man, a homosexual, has been found stoned to death. And then what seemed to be a community issue becomes way, way bigger. And there's also the discussion of Brexit as a background. So Brian Mcgilliway and Ken Bruin are the ones I've been dealing the most, and they can give you a bit of 2 different approaches, but at the same time speaking about the same thing, which is today's Ireland and Ireland in the world too.
Okay, thank
Camila?
you.
Is that helpful, Jessica?
Can you hear?
Yes, Bruce.
Thank you. Just let me put in one word there. Let me say, first of all, the papers are beautiful. They're fascinating. I've really enjoyed this session. I sat right through it and, listened and peeked at everything. And it's very rich. I'm particularly interested in the new Irish issue, Irish migrants and their responses. And I found a new novelist. I thank you very much for that, Victor. It's very rewarding. Valeria has slipped away for a moment. I did want to ask her a question. Is she there?
I think she will be back.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
you have another question for another panelist?
Yeah. Well, no. I'd like to.
Oh, she's back.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to waste your time, but I'm briefly stuck.
Oh no! Feel free to ask your question.
There's this. About the Irish detective novelist, it does occur to me to say that the element of dysfunctionality in the stories is immense. And in fact, Valerie has raised the question whether it's appropriate to look at them through an identity focus. And she remarks that many of the writers themselves are not preoccupied with Irish ethnicity, Irish nationalism per se. The response to the Celtic Tiger is enormous. That's about modernity, and that's about Irish integration or misintegration into the wider economic systems of the late capitalist world, if you will, and abandoning the communitarian principles of the literary revival. The country has been, frankly, an ethnic, cultural ghetto for quite a long time, and all this is rather opening out. There's the American influence and so on. Serial killers. Probably the greatest hurt to Irish psyche in modern times has been the mothers' homes, the mother and children's homes, the discovery that the Irish are capable of acts as heinous as anyone else. Not merely to other people, we all do that somewhat, and that would nicely cover the cases of the Nigerians in Wexford and Dublin, but to ourselves, to a group of people whom we consider to be ourselves. And the wonderful thing about Ken Bruin, I think, I'm rather a fan of the Netflix series, you know. Jack Taylor is a great man, but that sense that a dysfunctional individual, the policeman is dysfunctional because, of course, he's a gumshoe and he's an alcoholic. But what he discovers persistently are dysfunctional people. He discovers vigilantes involved in their own psychosexual turmoil. He discovers outright serial killers. He discovers every degree of queerdom, and he digests it with his wonderful Galwegian patois as though it was just the time of day. And it's that recognition that Ireland is, in fact, fully a participant in, I slightly lose my way here, but in the degenerate culture of late capitalist societies anywhere. Ireland is New York. Ireland is Liverpool. Ireland is Paris, and all these things are hugely interchangeable. Incidentally, I think it's all vastly motivated by the prevalence of not so much social media as Netflix itself. I mean, the availability of narratives in other societies is extraordinary now. And the narratives you're getting are, what's the most frequent article on screen in an American movie? It's not a tree, it's not a person, it's not a glasses frame, it's a gun. And you know, and this is what's arrived here and what we're part of. Of course we're part of it, but we were immune or self-immune. I don't actually buy the economic answer. Flann O'Brien pointed out that the majoritarian readership in Ireland in the 1930s were reading cowboy books.
Yeah.
Now the step up from cowboy books to detective is essentially nothing. You know, I mean, there's as we're moving across, because you needed that kind of narrative for your gung-ho hero then, you need the detective narrative now. I've really offered all I have on this subject. It's very interesting. But there it is. You have policemen in your novels, and also in Martin McDonagh, there are policemen, and you know, The Guard is a detective story. And just as I happen to be looking at the Irish attitude towards policemen, which is very weird and murky, by the way, compared with the British or the American or even the Brazilian, where you have slightly schizophrenic attitudes towards police.
Well, Bruce, since you addressed to me, well, it's obvious that your work has been of great interest to me, as all the others, because crime novels and police are intertwined, of course. Not only because of the detective's character present, but also as a part of the context in which it emerged back in the 19th century and which it developed until today. And also talking to Jessica, I just rushed to my small library here in this lovely Galway house. Yeah. So this is the Magdalene Martyrs.
All right, there you are. Bang on.
It's probably one of the best because it has to do with a local thing, the Magdalene House Laundry here in Galway, a national.
I thought it was in Dublin.
Which is there was one in Galway too. So that's the local, the national chain, and also Ken Bruin also goes more deeper psychologically, if it's possible, because turns out that there is a personal link to the Magdalene's laundry and Jack Taylor. So it's probably one of the ones, a book you'd like to
Yeah. I
to
know
read
Jack Taylor's
Jessica.
background is a bit uncertain. Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you.
No, and
Delighted.
he's great. I haven't been lucky enough to come across him, but he is a regular in many of the businesses.
Are you telling me that Jack Taylor is a person?
No, I'm sorry. Ken Bruin. No, well,
Oh,
right
right.
now I
Okay.
can tell one thing from the other. The
There
Crane,
you
which is
are.
the bar Jack Taylor goes to,
Okay.
just
Right.
reopened. So later
Right.
today, I'm going in for a pint to celebrate this panel.
Have one for me.
Okay,
On
wonderful.
I
me.
will.
Marcel wants to ask Bruce a question. So Marcel, if you could open your mic, you can ask
Marcel de Lima.
Bruce.
Yes,
Yes.
that's
Hey,
the right
Marcel.
one. Hi, Bruce. How you doing?
Good man. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I'm so sorry I missed your lecture. I was
Okay. I'll post
teaching
you something.
online, right at the time
Yeah.
you were speaking there, but I might have missed what I intend to ask you now. Just so
Yep.
pardon my lack of knowledge in case you've already covered this, but I'm sure you might rephrase it in a way so that I can listen to it again. So you're talking about Stephens's The Charwoman's Daughter, right?
True.
And usually Stephens's work's been scholarly criticized in terms of the relation between art and nationalism, that is way more political views. But I'm sure this particular piece that you tackled now has been read and praised as a fictional study of adolescence, right? It's been termed as the Irish version of Cinderella. But also I was wondering if you could deal with possibly how this is also one of his earliest instances to show this sort of dichotomous view he claims between Blake's cosmogony and Blavatsky's theosophical doctrines. And if you could possibly elaborate on this dichotomy that is also present there between these two views, as I said. I don't know if I made myself clear.
No, it's fine. I understand that question. I'll take just a couple of minutes on it. You know your Irish onions there. You've got a good grasp on the ingredients of the literary revival. Clearly, The Charwoman's Daughter is not a Cinderella story. As soon as you get embedded in it, you realize it's actually about sexual violence. The policeman is a potential wife beater. It says as much. He'd beat Jesus out of her if he got a chance. And I'm reading it obviously as an allegory of the national situation, of the colonial situation. I'm not very fond of trite readings, but I think that's quite a trite reading in a sense. These large shapes like nationalism crop up in criticism, and they have to be controlled. They themselves are slightly wild beasts. What you're proposing is a more nuanced and exact reading of his mental equipment, his mental kit bag. He read Blavatsky. He knew everything that George Russell knew. He learned from the Dublin Theosophists. And like Joyce and many others, and Joyce I very much underscore in this case, he was a cosmologist, as you say. So full marks, Professor de Lima. Stephens was a cosmologist. He tried in his novels to give an idea of the schema of the universe, or the human universe. And for him, the poles and pillars of it were forces which were equivalent to male and female. So the constant, he calls it debate between, the rending debate between male. I'm sorry to be depressing about this. He's not entirely so. He does think that there are compatible incompatibles. Now, in his realist stories, like Here Are Women, he simply treats of different grades of marriage. Good marriages, bad marriages, marriages to be, marriages that don't happen, marriages that founder, marriages in which the partners loathe each other so much they wish they died, and when they die, they find themselves desolate and incapable of subsistence, all those things. So those schemas, the male and the female, were very much yin and yang. They were part of, that's not Blavatsky, I know that's Buddhism, but they were very much part of the great forces of a mandala-style world. And he therefore symbolizes at all stages. He symbolized in that way. The last thing I'd like to say about this is that he's often treated as a modern writer, he's often treated as a realist. He's not. That's to say, he's using essentially a folkloric vehicle to do the work of modern sociology, which is a very odd trick. And, you know, it's questionable whether he pulls that off. I mean, if you take, for example, all the novels I've heard discussed today, these are realist novels, which are deeply embedded in the naturalistic tradition. That's the way they work. And they fundamentally presume a continuity between private experience and the literary form. That's what the modern novel is. You know, I'm sure you'll agree with that. But he's slightly pre-modern in the sense that if it's not a fable, fablio, if it's not adorned with anti-realistic characters, it's not a Stevens book. And yet at the same time, he addresses fairly sharp-edged questions like, should the British be in Ireland? Or should men and women behave differently towards each other than they do? That's my answer.
Excellent, Bruce.
Okay.
Thanks a lot once again.
Okay, thank you, Bruce and Marcel. Okay, so I think we can conclude now. I thank our speakers for the brilliant presentations. It was a lot of food for thought. Your research is very interesting. Okay, so congratulations. I invite you all to our next session on YouTube. It will be Jackie O'Halloran Bernstein, Eliza Lynch in Context at 2 p.m. Okay, so see you later. Bye.